In Captain America: The First Avenger, Steve Rogers signs up to take part in Project Rebirth, and we learn that one of the scientists who helped create this hero was Howard Stark, the future father of Tony Stark, a character who the audience had already become acquainted with in the 2008 film Iron Man and its successor. This is an example of retroactive continuity, or retconning, where new information is presented that causes the audience to reinterpret previously depicted events, and in this case leads to what I call shrinking the story world, where cameos, crossovers, or Easter eggs from other parts of a franchise work to link previously disparate elements of the plot, making the story world, or universe, feel more interconnected and thus, by extension, smaller. For Captain America to work together with Howard Stark to end World War II and then 70 years later end up fighting aliens alongside his son is the type of thing that'd make a guy say, huh, it's a small world. Now, an individual crossover doesn't instantly make the Marvel Universe feel like a small place. Coincidences can happen after all. But each additional one added to the pile makes things seem ever so slightly smaller, until eventually it feels like no matter where you turn, you're bound to notice something or someone you've seen before. Now, this isn't inherently a bad thing. After all, the MCU was designed to be this way. It was based on a concept that was all about characters from separate stories coming together and interacting with each other, and the main appeal of the franchise was the way in which everything felt interconnected, something that hadn't really been done on that scale in the medium of film before. Marvel Comics were marketed as the world outside your window, so the idea that you can bump into any of these heroes on the street was kind of the point. Compared to DC, their primary competition, who created places like Metropolis and Gotham City, Marvel set most of their stories in real places because they wanted the audience to feel like they were reading stories about real people. Spider-Man, Iron Man, Captain America, Doctor Strange, Hawkeye, Daredevil, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, Punisher, Jessica Jones, the Fantastic Four, and the X-Men all live and operate within the bounds of New York, so it makes sense that they would keep bumping into each other when they're in such close proximity. Besides what we're seeing on screen, there's nothing else of interest happening in the Marvel Universe because, without the heroes inhabiting it, it's just the same as our world. But this isn't the case for everything. There is something to be said for the power of the setting. In A New Hope, when Luke enters the cantina, he and the audience is met for the first time with a glimpse of what the Star Wars galaxy outside of Tatooine looks like. And we are taken into a world completely foreign to our own. A bar filled with creatures of all different shapes and sizes, a little bat thing, some reptilian guys, a couple blue aliens, the devil for some reason, a freaking wolf man. Han Solo hangs out with this big furry creature, and that's treated as completely normal. The message is clear. There are a lot of people in this galaxy, and they come from a lot of different places. Where are those places? Doesn't matter, we've already moved on with the plot. None of those people are relevant to the story we're telling right now, so they aren't given the opportunity to take any focus away from it. Because this visual here is for one purpose only: world building. To establish that the galaxy is bigger than we previously thought. When Han says,
"I've outrun Imperial starships. Not the local bulk cruisers, mind you. I'm talking about the big Carillion ships now."
And expects the others to comprehend what that means, it tells the audience that these characters have a shared understanding of things that don't exist in our world. There's an entire galaxy filled with other things happening, and we're just getting a glimpse into it. And that's exactly the appeal. The idea of a large story world is beneficial for a franchise because it sparks imagination, creates greater intrigue and inspiration for future stories set in that world, and makes the story we're witnessing feel that much more important and unique. In this type of story, the setting is just as important as the characters. For Star Wars, in contrast to something like Marvel, shrinking the story world becomes a problem because it undermines the necessity of creative new ideas and discourages exploration of the unique setting. In 2012, the Walt Disney Company purchased the rights to Star Wars from George Lucas for over $4 billion. Since then, Disney has had complete creative control over the Star Wars brand, and many fans have complained that the company has made the franchise too similar to Marvel, specifically citing the use of quippy, lighthearted dialogue and a general tone similar to that found in the MCU films.
So who talks first? You talk first? I talk first?
But I would argue that the biggest detriment to Star Wars since Disney's takeover has been its constantly shrinking galaxy. Let's turn the clock back a minute. Before Disney bought the franchise, Star Wars had already seen the effects of shrinking the story world. This started with the prequels. Episodes 1, 2, and 3, in the interest of appealing to the original fans and connecting the movies, as is always the case, put several references into their films that were not necessary or productive to the main plot. So, where having Anakin and Obi-Wan present was key to telling the story, retconning Yoda and Chewbacca into being friends wasn't. Now, Boba Fett wasn't just some bounty hunter who Jabba hired to capture Han, he was the son of this guy, who met and fought Obi-Wan as a child. C-3PO wasn't just R2-D2's friend, he was actually built by Darth Vader. This little training ball wasn't just a random device on the Millennium Falcon, it was actually a tool used by the Jedi to train all of their younglings that Han just so happened to have lying around for some reason. All of these little coincidences are the types of things that make the galaxy seem just a little bit smaller. But the prequels mostly did a good job staying away from this, and spent more of their time introducing new things. New characters, new ships, new planets. In fact, the only planet from the original trilogy that was reused in the prequels was Tatooine, and even then some would argue that planet could have been changed and the movies would have been better for it. Places like Coruscant, Kamino, Mustafar, regardless of what you think of these places, they're at least something that hadn't been seen already. An example that the galaxy is bigger than what we previously understood. Plus, the film still made an effort to reference things, events, or places that the audience didn't recognize to give the sense that other things are happening off-screen.
Well, you owe me one, and not for saving your skin for the 10th time.
9th time. That business on Cato Nemoidia doesn't count.
Though it might have lessened to some extent, the galaxy of the Star Wars prequels still felt unexplored. The prequels were then followed up by the Clone Wars series, which retroactively took their galaxy and made it smaller. Now, even though it was implied in this scene that Obi-Wan had never met Grievous before this point and appears surprised later when he sees that he has 4 arms, it's actually revealed that the two had encountered each other countless times during the Clone Wars.
I've been trained in your Jedi arts by Count Dooku.
And if we look at this scene,
My powers have doubled since the last time we met, Count.
the last time was apparently a few weeks ago based on this show. Also, Obi-Wan's comment,
This time we will do it together.
doesn't make any sense, since in their last encounter with Dooku they fought him together. These scenes of heroes fighting established villains were included to inject more action into the show, but only served to make the movies make less sense. Or at least take away the significance of certain moments. A big thing like Anakin and Dooku's rematch has a lot less weight when you learn those were a dime a dozen. They're especially frustrating because the show did introduce new villain characters which could have been used instead. If they needed a competent antagonist for the Jedi to fight, why didn't they bring back Dirge from the original Clone Wars cartoon? This guy's whole deal was that he was literally unkillable. But since the series had 7 seasons worth of content to fill, they felt the need to put in fights between Anakin and Dooku all the time, and between Obi-Wan and Grievous, and for some reason Anakin never questions how he's always coincidentally just out of sight of Grievous so that they can justify the line,
You're shorter than I expected.
In the Clone Wars, everyone interacts with everyone else. Any named character will inevitably meet any other named character, because a long-form series lends itself to that type of storytelling. Eventually, you're going to run out of ideas, so you'll send this guy to go talk to that guy and see what their interaction leads to. And since they're catering to fans of the prequels, of course they would bring back characters from those films, like Padme and Boba and Jabba, and guess who's back from beyond the grave, it's Maul. The Clone Wars made a point to include every cameo possible, and even ones that shouldn't have been. Then, Disney bought Star Wars, and the first thing they created was Star Wars Rebels. This show saw the introduction of an entirely new cast of characters, but it also saw the reintroduction of Ahsoka Tano, Captain Rex, Bo-Katan, Saw Gerrera, Hondo Ohnaka, this guy, Wolf, and Gregor, who had already died. And guess who's back? Again, it's Maul. Also, Hera, the pilot of the Ghost, wasn't just her own character, she was also the daughter of Cham Syndulla, the Twi'lek freedom fighter introduced in the Clone Wars. Rebels served more as a sequel to Clone Wars than anything else, so many of these reintroductions weren't entirely unwarranted, but this is the point where one has to start asking themselves, is this being done for the story or for the fans? These two characters have never met each other before, so their interaction only has significance to people who have seen whatever show or movie they were in before. The year after Rebels premiered saw the release of The Force Awakens, where we witnessed the return of Han Solo, Leia, Luke, C-3PO, and R2-D2. Luke's lightsaber is given great significance, and Obi-Wan's voice is also heard. And, though this film did do a good enough job introducing its own unique cast of heroes who could star in this new trilogy, it also made one of the most short-sighted errors in shrinking the universe, letting the fans do it themselves. You see, J.J. Abrams pulled his patented trick in this film of introducing mystery boxes, which are essentially questions that he introduces to the audience without actually having a planned answer. If you want more on this, he has a whole TED Talk on the subject. I could go into detail on why I disagree with the concept of mystery boxes when it comes to storytelling, and might in a future video, but for now I just want to address the problems it created in regards to this issue. Abrams introduced a character like Rey and then asked the audience, who are her parents? The audience, given that they have nothing else to work on, are naturally going to reach to other pre-established characters in the Star Wars canon to answer that question. After all, that's the only interesting answer a person could come up with to a question like that, since saying her father is John Doe doesn't do justice to a question that is posed with such significance. So now you're left with a million theories that Rey's mother is this person or Rey's father is that person, and she can't be her own character anymore because you've created an audience expectation that she has to be connected to someone else. The same thing was true with Snoke. So, though The Force Awakens did not explicitly connect Rey and Snoke to the previous films, it set the precedent that they were going to have to somehow be weaved into the existing narrative in order to be relevant by implying that their backstory had some importance. The following year saw the release of Rogue One, which did its best to focus on a unique cast of characters in a standalone film, but still indulged in including characters like Saw Gerrera, Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, those rebel pilots from Episode 4, creepy CGI Tarkin, and creepy CGI Leia. Plus, of course, the big fan service moments with Darth Vader. Despite the abundance of cameos, this movie doesn't offend me too much because most of them are pretty justifiable. They're not just characters being thrown in from anywhere, they're people who would be reasonably expected to be here at this point in time. Yeah, it makes sense that most of these rebel characters would show their faces at such a pivotal point for the rebellion. It makes sense that, in a movie about the development of the Death Star, Tarkin would be around to watch. Despite ultimately existing only to give context to a single line from the opening crawl of A New Hope, I think Rogue One is an example of how to do crossover right. Yes, these cameos are just here for fan service, but from a story perspective, the writers don't need to jump through hoops to justify them. And, in a side story, I consider that harmless fun. Then there was The Last Jedi, which made an attempt to pull back on this trend. The Last Jedi actively tried to swerve away from the precedent set up in the previous film by stating outright that its protagonist did not come from any bloodline of importance and that the villain's secret identity was irrelevant. It planted its foot down and said the story was about these new characters now, not the old ones. There was a brief period of peace in the galaxy. Then Solo came out, and guess who's back again? It's Maul. Inexplicably, Maul shows up in a hologram message to Han Solo's girlfriend, switches on his lightsaber to make sure you know it's him, then pieces out. This is probably the most egregious example of unnecessary crossover in history because his presence here is completely irrelevant and pointless to the story. Any audience who would know that Maul had survived the Phantom Menace would also most likely know that he died not too long after this film is set, so whatever he's doing here is of little consequence in the grand scheme of things. And any audience who didn't know that he survived the Phantom Menace would be completely confused as to what the hell he's doing here. Anyone who wanted to resolve that confusion would go home, look it up, and find out that he just died again anyway. It is so obvious that this scene is only shoved in here so that people who recognize the character can point at the screen and go, I know who that is, and then move on without thinking about it for more than 2 seconds. Where Star Wars used to make references for the specific purposes of making the audience realize how little they actually know, now they do the exact opposite. Now every reference is there so fans can pat themselves on the back for how smart they are. Instead of focusing on good writing for people to enjoy, they appeal to fans' prior knowledge of the franchise to make the audience feel like they're in on some big secret. And that is exactly the problem with this trend of shrinking the story world. It has the negative side effects of making the galaxy feel smaller and less alive, while also hardly ever actually contributing to the story, at least not in a way that couldn't be achieved through more creative means. Solo also brings back the Pike Syndicate from Clone Wars and Rebels, tries to give significance to irrelevant things like the dice that can be seen hanging in the Millennium Falcon for approximately 1 second in the original trilogy, and spends an unfortunately long portion of its plot justifying a throwaway line from A New Hope that was clearly supposed to be interpreted as a lie by Han to boast false accomplishments.
It's the ship that made the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs.
The other thing about prequels especially is how they rush timelines so that everything is in place to set the events of the original into motion. In 2 hours and 15 minutes, Solo depicts Han deserting the Empire, meeting Chewbacca, getting his blaster, meeting Lando, doing the Kessel Run, winning the Millennium Falcon, and going to Tatooine to work with Jabba for the job that will inevitably put him in the debt that's causing all his problems at the beginning of A New Hope. This movie would have you believe that every significant event in Han Solo's life before the start of the original trilogy happened within a span of about 3 days. That's another way in which the universe gets smaller. Not only do things feel physically closer to each other, but unrealistically close in time as well. To justify these crossovers, everything important needs to be happening all at once. Then there was The Rise of Skywalker, a film that was so concerned with referencing other movies that it forgot to make its own coherent plot. Palpatine is alive. Rey is Palpatine's granddaughter. Snoke was made by Palpatine. Palpatine has been putting voices in Kylo Ren's head. Lando shows up and is maybe this woman's father? Chewie gets a medal as if they refused it to him on Yavin and he spent the last 35 years bitterly waiting for one. What the fuck? But then, they released a little show called The Mandalorian. And once again, it seemed like Star Wars had been saved. This was a real breath of fresh air for the franchise. A new cast of characters, new locations, a new plot, totally separate from the films. They reused things that were familiar from the films, but they were always things that felt like they naturally fit into the story. The show wasn't saying, here's that one character you recognize, what are the odds he'd show up here? It was saying, here are some Jawas, they're a race of creatures, so it makes sense they'd be in various places across the galaxy. Or, here's a droid that looks like IG-88. Naturally, since droids are mass-produced, it makes sense you'd see more than one of them that look alike. The show's references were always ones that simply served to give it the Star Wars aesthetic, without ever shoving a specific callback down the audience's throat. One of my favorite examples of this was the appearance of the AT-ST in Episode 4. The audience was already familiar with the AT-ST and what it is capable of, but this episode completely recontextualized it. From the cockpit of Luke's snowspeeder in Empire Strikes Back, the many tiny AT-STs look insignificant and non-threatening, not something he has to worry about. But from the ground to the Mandalorian and a group of villagers, one AT-ST appears massive and daunting. Taking it out is a major feat. This does a great job of establishing disparity in scale. We're not watching Star Wars from the perspective of a great hero. We're watching Star Wars from the perspective of a normal guy. The series created new lore, it fleshed out the Mandalorian culture in interesting ways, and it obviously cared more about achieving the style of Star Wars while making its own story than reusing the old characters. The closest thing I can think of to a crossover in this show is probably the planet of Tatooine, and that barely qualifies. And then Season 2 had to come along and screw it all up. Mandalorian Season 2 wasn't bad, but it was clear that at some point the show had become far more concerned with making the Star Wars franchise more interconnected than it was with telling a good story. Now, almost every episode saw a new cameo. Episode 1, The Mandalorian finds Boba Fett's old armor. But, here's the twist, someone else is wearing it. I initially thought this was brilliant. It was a great way to reintroduce the best aspect of Boba Fett, the cool factor, while also doing something new rather than retreading old ground. I honestly would have preferred they stuck with Cobb Vanth rather than bringing back Boba Fett because, let's face it, the only thing people liked about Boba was his armor. He never actually did anything. He mostly just stood around, said a few lines, tracked down Han Solo, then got taken out in the lamest way possible. The way this episode started made it seem like they were going to ignore the fan hype around a falsely built up character and instead keep the one thing people actually liked about him while simultaneously introducing a new, engaging character. I would have loved to see a show about this guy. He actually had a personality. He was cool, he had the Western cowboy aesthetic, and he was something new. They could have had the episode end with Vanth agreeing to give up the armor, but the Mandalorian begrudgingly allowing him to keep it, deciding that he was worthy of it. A lot of Mandalorian Season 2 saw questions about what being a Mandalorian truly means, so this idea would work story-wise as well. Vanth proved his honor, and thus he is worthy to call himself a Mandalorian. But instead, we go the boring route, and at the end of the episode we see that Boba Fett is in fact still alive and well. Episode 2 didn't have any cameos, save for those Resistance pilots from Season 1, which is relatively minor except for the fact that they may be playing a larger role in a future series. Episode 3 saw the return of Bo-Katan from the Clone Wars and Rebels. Given that she's a Mandalorian and the show is about Mandalorians, I can reluctantly give this one a pass. Episode 4 hinted at a potential connection between the Mandalorian and the creation of Supreme Leader Snoke by suggesting that the child was involved in the initial cloning process. Then, Episode 5 saw the reintroduction of Ahsoka Tano. This is where things started getting excessive for me. Why did it need to be Ahsoka Tano? What did her involvement specifically add to the story? It just had to be some Jedi. It could have been Jedi Master John Smith, the Ewok Jedi. Hell, that would have made more sense because Ahsoka isn't even a Jedi at this point in the story. She acts like one throughout the episode, but then also mentions that she isn't one. She says Baby Yoda can't be trained because he formed attachments, but she's not a Jedi, she doesn't follow that code. No, they used Ahsoka Tano specifically to set up other shows, and because they knew that fans were going to freak out when they saw her. I remember her, she was in the Clone Wars. Wouldn't it have been interesting to introduce a new character here like they did with Cobb Vanth in Episode 1? Or for him to find no Jedi and to be forced to follow some clues to get to where he's trying to go instead? And even though you technically don't have to know who Ahsoka Tano is to understand what's going on in this episode, I think the amount of references in her dialogue and general sense of importance she gives off would make the average person who hasn't seen any of the shows begin to suspect that they're missing something.
Where is Grand Admiral Thrawn?
Yeah, I'll do you one better. Who's
Grand Admiral Thrawn?
In The Empire Strikes Back, when Obi-Wan says, "Go to Dagobah, there you will find Yoda," it isn't followed with a long pause and a swell of music, because you're not expected to recognize that name. But here, that's exactly what happens because they expect you to have done your research. And the sad part is that before, they didn't. Back in Season 1, the references were all basic Star Wars concepts, and those that weren't were very minor things placed in as Easter eggs, things that didn't draw attention to themselves, that a die-hard fan could point at and say, "I know what that is," and a casual viewer wouldn't even notice without missing something. That's the type of callback these movies should be trying to make. Instead, they come off as advertisements. Want to understand what's going on? Go watch our other shows on Disney+. The point is, after watching an episode, a person shouldn't have to go onto Google and look up who is Grand Admiral Thrawn. Star Wars as a whole has its head stuck so far up its own ass at this point that you need a reading list if you want to understand what the fuck anyone is talking about. In Episode 6, Boba Fett made his official debut. Nearly every episode at this point had brought in a pre-existing Star Wars character for a one-off cameo, just to remind the audience that this is a Star Wars show. Notably, Episode 7, possibly the best episode of the season, did not introduce any new cameos, focusing entirely on the show's original characters. Boba Fett didn't even need to be here. In fact, he didn't really need to be in the show at all, becoming pretty much irrelevant after getting his armor, with nothing left to contribute. Just standing around in the background, like the good old days. He was just waiting until he could do his post-credits scene. Finally, at the very end, we saw the arrival of Luke. This reveal might have hit a little harder if the rest of the season up until this point hadn't already been packed to the brim with characters from outside the series that a Star Wars fan would recognize. And that, I stress, is yet another reason why this shrinking of the story world hurts so much. because when it is done so carelessly, it makes actually important callbacks or crossovers feel underwhelming. The Bad Batch had the same problem, but to an even greater degree. Episode 1 came swinging right out of the gate with a cameo from Kanan Jarrus from Star Wars Rebels. Okay, fine, grab the audience's attention with a character they recognize. Except then there's also Tarkin from A New Hope, and these two Kaminoans from Attack of the Clones, and Saw Gerrera from Clone Wars, Rebels, and Rogue One. Episode 2 has Cut, the deserter from the Clone Wars. Episode 4 features Fennec, the bounty hunter from The Mandalorian. Episode 5 has the Rancor and Bib Fortuna. Episode 6 has the Martez sisters from Clone Wars Season 7. Episode 7 has Captain Rex. Episodes 8 and 9 have Cad Bane. Episodes 11 and 12 have Cham and Hera Syndulla. Episode 13 has the Pike Syndicate from the Clone Wars, Rebels, and Solo. Episode 14 has Captain Gregor from the Clone Wars and Rebels. What are the chances that in nearly every episode our heroes would encounter a character we already know and love from one of 9 movies and a few TV shows? And then, the most recent example, The Book of Boba Fett. A show that literally had an entire episode dedicated to the protagonist of a different series. Ignoring the fact that this entire series is just an excuse to bring back an irrelevant character from the dead, the first few episodes admittedly do a pretty decent job doing their own thing, even if that thing isn't very good. They brought back this Wookiee, Black Chrysanthemum, a pretty deep cut considering he'd only appeared in comics before this point, and the Pike Syndicate again, but in the beginning there wasn't too much crossover here. Then we hit episode 5, which consists entirely of cameos. I mean, seriously, this episode does not contain the title character of the show at all. Instead, it's the return of all your favorite characters from The Mandalorian, like the Armorer, and this guy, and this lady. Now, since The Mandalorian did already know Boba Fett before this point, their connecting here doesn't technically shrink the story world any more than it already was, since it makes sense that they'd contact each other again, but dedicating an entire episode to bringing back previous characters still falls under the umbrella of excessive crossover, which is ultimately the root of the problem. What does directly shrink the story world is the reveal that this guy is actually a descendant of Pre Vizsla from the Clone Wars. In episode 6, we have the return of the better Boba Fett, R2-D2, Ahsoka Tano, Cad Bane, and, oh god, terrifying CGI Luke is back. Why? He doesn't even do anything to contribute to this show. Plus, apparently, Luke has Yoda's lightsaber. I guess he rummaged through all his stuff on Dagobah after watching him die? At least Boba Fett does make an actual appearance in this episode. For about a minute. If I could say this show had one thing going for it, it was the premise. A sort of Godfather-esque organized crime story set in the Star Wars universe sounds really compelling. It's not necessarily the most tactical decision for a franchise that is primarily based on action, but I guess that's what makes it interesting. It might not necessarily be a good idea, but it is a new one. I've said new a lot here because it's important. But unfortunately, the show did very little to actually uphold the promised concept, with most of its runtime dedicated to more trudging through sand as if Star Wars didn't have enough of that already, and the typical action set pieces. I think the point has been made. Shrinking the story world is putting the creatives at Lucasfilm in a position where they don't have to be creative. Why go to a new planet when we can just go back to Tatooine for the 100th time? Why introduce a new character when we can just bring back an old one and get a wider fan reaction? They don't have to, so they won't. And the byproduct of that unoriginality is that the Star Wars galaxy doesn't feel like a galaxy at all. And now, if I get this video out on time, we find ourselves approaching Obi-Wan Kenobi, which leads me to... So, where is Star Wars headed? Well, if you don't like an increasingly shrinking galaxy, the future doesn't look particularly bright. When I first heard about it, I was really excited for the Kenobi series. It seemed to have a lot going for it, like the return of Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan, and the choice of director Deborah Chow, who did some of the best episodes of The Mandalorian. But the worsening of this trend and the emergence of new details has made me fear that Kenobi too will go down the same path as these other shows. First, there was the marketing that seemed to suggest that, in true Clone Wars fashion, it might include another encounter between Obi-Wan and Anakin between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. Then there was the first teaser, which couldn't go 30 seconds without showing Luke, and which proceeded to reveal that Uncle Owen is back, and that the Inquisitors are back, and that they look terrible. And then reports came out that apparently at one point they were going to have, guess who, that's right, Maul return again. All of this does not bode well for the originality and story potential of this series. Note, this is not meant to be taken as a criticism of the relevant actors. I'm glad that Hayden Christensen is in the role again, but I would have preferred to see him in a flashback to flesh out the relationship between the two characters rather than the way the marketing seems to suggest this is going to go. I think another encounter between Vader and Obi-Wan will cheapen the existing moment in A New Hope.
I sense something. A presence I've not felt since last Tuesday.
Hi, this is me talking from the editing chair. So if you couldn't tell, I'm a bit behind on this video. I've had the idea to talk about this since back when The Bad Batch was being released, but the sheer amount of content it required I cover made the process of writing and rewriting the script a major undertaking. Once I'd finalized the script and recorded my audio, I planned to get the finished video out before the premiere of the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, but the amount of time it took to edit everything made me late. So I decided to wait until the finale so I could incorporate my thoughts on that show into this discussion. I'm not going to put as much time into editing the visuals of this part because I've spent long enough on this video and I want to get it out now before another Star Wars show passes me by. So it'll probably just be the trailer playing in the background and the audio quality might not be as good. I've already laid out what my expectations were for the Kenobi series before it was released, but after seeing the first 2 episodes I was pleasantly surprised by how things were handled. Yes, it did include all the characters that showed up in the trailers, like Uncle Owen, Luke, and the Inquisitors, as well as Bail Organa and Leia. However, the inclusion of Leia as a main character was a surprisingly well-justified decision, to the point where it felt more like a plot decision than a fan service one. The obvious choice in a show like this would be to have Luke get into some kind of trouble, requiring Ben to go save him, which would have been predictable and opened the door for more contrivances. And yeah, they did end up doing that in the end, and it was kind of unnecessary. But making the character Leia is not only a clever subversion of that expectation, but is also a justifiable way of getting him off Tatooine, even if his leaving Tatooine still bothers me somewhat, and adds some more depth to their connection through the message she sends him in A New Hope. Of course, this also brings up the question of why, in that message, she only talks about how he served her father in the Clone Wars, and doesn't mention the fact that he saved her life, or why she doesn't seem to care at all when he dies, given that her connection with him was so close. Also, I'd argue the paternal figure protecting a child motif has become a little overused in Star Wars recently, but that's a subject for another time. But despite this initial positive feeling, I knew deep down I was in for disappointment when the inevitable Darth Vader confrontation, which had been teased everywhere, was going to happen. And that feeling was confirmed earlier than I was expecting in Episode 3. Let me put the positives out there. The way this scene portrays Vader himself is pretty great. It does an excellent job depicting a mixture of the wild, reckless emotions of Anakin Skywalker with the calm, controlled rage of Darth Vader. Putting this depiction between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope does create a smoother transition into that character, but it still has the problem of feeling like it doesn't belong. It's like those Clone Wars fights I mentioned before. Now, instead of there being one duel between Anakin and Obi-Wan and one rematch to settle the score, there are 4 different fights with only 2 of them actually having any long-lasting effects. That makes any one of the fights seem less intense and more routine. Another thing I didn't mention before about encounters like this that happen in prequels is how unsatisfying they are. The tension is already lacking since the audience knows there are going to be no serious consequences to this fight since both parties have to survive, and when it's all over nothing has actually changed. Nobody dies, nobody is seriously hurt. These fights do nothing but show 2 people hitting their laser swords against each other for a couple minutes before somebody runs away. It's boring. The whole idea of a lightsaber battle is that things are about to get intense. Especially in the original trilogy, the lightsabers were only pulled out for a big moment. The feeling the audience should get if 2 people ignite their lightsabers is that one person isn't walking away from this encounter. Out of 12 lightsaber fights in episodes 1 through 6, only 3 end without someone dying or losing a limb. But fights like this take all of that power out of the weapon. This scene says it's entirely possible to enter a lightsaber duel with someone, even someone as strong as Darth Vader, and for both parties to walk away just fine. For cameos, there wasn't much, but they did throw in a pretty egregious reference to Quinlan Vos for no apparent reason, and linger on it for several seconds. I find it pretty funny they chose this character specifically, since in the Clone Wars, Obi-Wan is depicted as not liking him. Palpatine also made a brief appearance at the end. Then there was the inevitable rematch in the finale, where Obi-Wan has to beat Vader to re-retcon the line, "When I last left you, I was but the learner, now I am the master," into making some level of sense. This fight just really bothered me because Vader gets his ass kicked by Obi-Wan again. These prequels should do more to enhance the presence of Darth Vader as a serious threat rather than diminishing it. The other episodes did a decent enough job with that, though episode 5 did undermine his badass moment of pulling the ship down by making him look like an idiot. But watching Vader lose in a fight to Obi-Wan again tells me he still isn't as powerful as the original trilogy makes him out to be. Anakin loses to Obi-Wan on Mustafar because he's still young and impulsive. But 10 years later, he should be in the prime of his abilities, not crawling toward his opponent wheezing pathetically. Now, when I rewatch A New Hope, I have to remember it took Vader 4 tries to kill Obi-Wan, and the only reason he succeeded the last time is because Obi-Wan let him win. Also, the reason Obi-Wan tells Luke in A New Hope that Vader killed his father is because that's what Vader told him. And then Obi-Wan responds with the same line Luke says in Return of the Jedi. What is the point of this? The interaction itself isn't bad necessarily, but why does Vader need to tell Obi-Wan that Anakin Skywalker is dead? Obi-Wan should be able to tell that by looking at him and seeing all the horrible things he's done. The point of Obi-Wan telling Luke that Vader killed his father is that it reflects on how Obi-Wan sees Anakin, not just a repetition of something Vader said. Creating a prequel like this is essentially over-explaining information that the audience could have gathered from inference. Plus, quick note on Reva, Obi-Wan telling her that she can now choose to be good doesn't really match with the character, since in Empire Strikes Back, he and Yoda were both saying, "Once you start down the dark path, forever will it dominate your destiny." But that's about it. Regarding the subject matter of this video, the series didn't have as much in the realm of overt cameos as a lot of Star Wars content, but it did do quite a bit in terms of retconning. Okay, back to past me. Following that, there's going to be a spin-off series from Rogue One based on Cassian Andor for some reason, because I guess everyone was a huge fan of him. Then the Ahsoka Tano series, which is probably going to bring back Thrawn and have more tie-ins with Rebels, and the Rangers of New Republic, which will almost certainly tie in with the other events in that time period somehow. Now, the future project that has the most promise to me seems to be The Acolyte, simply because it is set in a time period where it will be far more difficult for producers or whoever to forcibly tie it to any other Star Wars media. Still, I'm sure they'll shove Yoda in there, since he was probably alive during that time. The Star Wars franchise seems to be trying to behave exactly like Marvel. Dave Filoni has essentially become the Kevin Feige of Star Wars. His name is attached to everything. And Filoni gets a lot of praise from Star Wars fans. He's treated as the savior of the franchise. Now, though some of that praise is not unwarranted, he is responsible for a lot of the positive things I've mentioned here after all. There are certain patterns in his decision-making that have contributed to the aforementioned problems in this media. Filoni seems to have a special fondness for his own characters, and thus puts them into everything he has a hand in. If you look back through the recurring characters I've mentioned in this video, some of the most frequently repeated ones are Ahsoka Tano, Captain Rex, and Darth Maul. Now, I know you might be thinking that Dave Filoni didn't invent the character of Darth Maul, but he did reinvent him. He took the silent and uninteresting villain from The Phantom Menace and made him compelling, giving him a reason to exist in the story. Filoni took Maul from being a footnote on the first film to the best part of the Clone Wars. And he deserves a lot of credit for that. But then he decided that that character should go into every piece of Star Wars media from then on. So he was. I think Filoni and the other creatives in charge at Lucasfilm give too much stock to fan opinions. Fans said they wanted Maul back from the dead, so Maul was brought back from the dead. Fans said they wanted Boba Fett back from the dead, so Boba Fett was brought back from the dead. After The Last Jedi dared do something different and was met with outrage, it seems like the strategy from here on out is just going to be to let the fans make all the decisions. But fans often don't know what they actually want until after it's been given to them. Fans might suggest one idea without considering that there was another idea they could have gotten that they would have preferred. People, as a collective, don't make good writing decisions. Movies made by committee are not good. And if fans are always given what they ask for, nothing surprising or interesting will ever happen. There's something to be said here about exercising creative intent. If we go back to the prequels again, regardless of what you think of quality, it's clear that Lucas had some creative drive to make those films. He had ideas for new planets, new things that could happen in the galaxy that he had created. I'd argue that a lot of those ideas were bad, but at least they were innovative. The more recent content, which relies almost entirely on taking existing characters and throwing them together in new combinations like smashing action figures against each other, feels more like a product than an idea. It has a corporate air to it, like it's being made solely for the purpose of selling the brand. And in order to sell the brand, you need brand synergy. People liked that character, better bring him back. Give a cameo to her, she just recently appeared in another show. This franchise is more concerned with self-reference than it is with telling an actual story. Star Wars has become like the Cheers bar. If everyone knows each other, it's not a very expansive galaxy at all. Let's look back at that scene from A New Hope. When Luke walks into the cantina, he doesn't look around to see a bunch of regular human people roaming about. He doesn't see his Uncle Owen or the Jawas or anything he's seen before. He is instead presented with something entirely different. A group of creatures that are completely alien to both him and, more importantly, to us, the audience. Because the scene exists to establish that we have entered a world that is not like our own. It is exciting because we are being given an opportunity to explore a place that is unfamiliar. It's new. That's important. Don't constantly rely on references to things already established just because they were successful before. It will cause your story to stagnate. The successful thing will always be there to look back on in your previous works, but reusing it constantly has the potential to degrade it. Instead, force your audience to become acquainted with something new. Put something out there that challenges them in a way they weren't familiar with. That creates the opportunity to build a great new idea. Star Wars needs to do scenes like this again. Hi, I'm Ethan, and I put story first. On this channel, I like to talk about movies, comic books, and any other stories I feel are worth discussing. Are there any examples of cameos and crossovers in Star Wars content that I missed? Let me know and we can talk about it in the comments. If you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, sharing it with someone, or subscribing to the channel. If you're new to the channel, I have a video where I talk all about The Mandalorian and how it relates to the hero's journey plot structure, plus a bunch of other non-Star Wars things you might like. I promise I don't usually ramble this long. To all of my current subscribers, thank you so much for sticking with me. I'm sorry about the slow upload schedule. I'm currently balancing this with college, but I'm doing my best to be more consistent with my videos. In the past couple months, I was also going back and forth between this and another video that I was trying to bring near completion, so be on the lookout because that might be coming soon. Until then, thank you all again for watching, and I hope you have a nice day.